Welcome to History, Mystery, and The Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. Today we're going to look at The Great Race. Not the fictionalized comedy from the 60s, but the historic journey from New York to Paris. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice. And be sure to give us a review. I'd love to hear what you think. Okay, before we get too much into this one, let's set the scene. The year is 1908. Despite a steam powered vehicle land speed record of 127 miles per hour, your average Joe that could afford a car is putting along at 35 to 40. It's winter, it's New York, and it's cold. To be exact, it is February 12th, 1908. Most cars don't have windshields, don't have roofs, and these really are just horseless carriages. That being said, car manufacturers are really proud of their new inventions and really want to know who's the best. There are 6 teams, 3 from France, 1 from Italy, 1 from Germany, and 1 from the United States. They are going to race from New York in the United States to Paris, France. It's interesting to note that 5 of these cars were custom built for this race. Not unlike today, if a car manufacturer is going to have their name on a vehicle involved in a race, they're going to want it to be the best. They're going to want to win. A victory becomes synonymous with the company as a whole. The 6th car in this race, the one that didn't customize their car, is Thomas. They chose a vehicle out of their customer lineup just 3 days for the start of the race. It was the previous year's model, a 4-cylinder, 60 horsepower Thomas Flyer. It was truly an underdog story and kind of a last minute decision to have a race across America, partially sponsored by an American newspaper, the New York Times. And not have an American company in the race didn't make sense. But the big companies, Ford and Buick, were already selling cars. A win would be nice, but it didn't mean much. A loss, on the other hand, could be devastating. A small company like Thomas, it was worth the gamble. The route was planned to cross the United States, drive up the coast through Canada to Valdez, Alaska, cross the Bering Strait to Siberia. Mind you, the Bering Strait land bridge melted 13,000 years ago, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Cars were few and far between at this time, which means roads were mostly non existent. Many of the cities they drove through along the way, everybody would come out to see them. Schools would actually be let out so the kids could have a chance to see a car. For many, this was the first time they ever saw one. In a lot of ways, the people on these teams were celebrities. They were a symbol of the future of the industry. Automobiles weren't trusted. They weren't thought of to have the endurance and long-term durability of a horse. The first leg of the race involved driving through snow 1 to 2 feet deep. The mechanics on each team would walk alongside the cars, laying down boards to drive over or packing down the snow ahead of them. At times, they even enlisted the help of locals to pull the cars with horses. The American team often got the best horse at the cheapest price, which didn't make the foreign teams all that happy, but you can't blame the drivers for home team advantage. At this point in the race, they weren't even really racing. The roads, or lack thereof, were so treacherous. They drove single file, one after another. Every 5 hours, they'd rotate out who was in the lead, just to be fair. If the bitter cold and deep snow wasn't bad enough, antifreeze wasn't invented yet. This meant that the fluids in the engine had to be drained every night to prevent freezing. As for gas stations, where I live now, I feel like there is one every few blocks. But at this time, places to get fuel weren't so prevalent. Again, in 1908, a car was an extreme luxury. It cost around $4,000, the equivalent of about 85,000 today. The first loss came, well, still in New York, only 96 miles from the starting line. One of the French cars, manufactured by Césaire Noda, broke its differential and could not proceed. It was about a month into the race by the time the drivers reached Colorado. So, about 3/4 of the way across the United States, when one of the members of the team driving the De Dion vehicle, one of the other French teams, swore his allegiance to the Americans and joined the crew of the Thomas Flyer. Hans Heinrich Hansen had gotten into such a dispute with his fellow teammate that pistols were almost drawn for a duel. Rather than fight to the death, he joined the Americans, which was good for them since shortly after that, the driver of the Thomas, Montague Monty Roberts, quit and the mechanic George Schuster took the wheel. Also around this time, the driver of the model block, the third French car, tried to sneak his vehicle onto a train in California. His plans were foiled by a journalist, and he dropped out of the race rather than face scandal. The first car to make it to Alaska, well, actually the only car to make it to Alaska, was the Thomas Flyer. They actually boated from San Francisco, California to Alaska rather than drive through Canada. The snow was so deep that they couldn't get their car off the boat. Schuster took a dog sled to scout ahead and realized that there was no way they were driving through the snow. It was also at this point that Schuster looked out over the ocean that separates the United States from Russia and said, I can't drive on that. Race organizers couldn't be bothered to check the solidity of the ice in the last 10,000 years or so. They decided that the drivers could instead drive to Seattle and boat to Japan, drive across the country, and take a second boat to Russia before resuming the road to Paris. The Italians, the Germans, and the remaining French went directly to Seattle, while the Americans had to backtrack. As a result, the officials declared that the Thomas Flyer had a 15-day lead, meaning that any of the other three could make it to Paris as much as 2 weeks before the Americans and still lose. Even today, the roads across that stretch of Russia are few and far between. In 1908, they were a joke. They didn't exist. The landscape was frozen tundra and wet, muddy swamps. The grueling conditions caused the last remaining French car, the De Dion, to quit. So, a race, half sponsored by a French newspaper, La Matin, that ended in a French city that started with 3 French cars from 3 different French manufacturers, now had no French representation. The remaining cars drove along the tracks of the recently completed Trans-Siberian Railway. It's hard to imagine bouncing along railroad tracks day after day in a car without shocks. In addition to battling the weather and the lack of roads, drivers also had to deal with bandits and thieves. In Schuster's diary, he talks about a moment in Siberia where they were stopped by a group of bandits on horseback. They were heavily armed. There was a language barrier, but it was clear that they weren't interested in chatting. Thinking quickly, the men in the car just started laughing and pointing at one another. Confused, the bandits left. With everything looking at this point like a guaranteed victory for the Americans and the Thomas Flyer, a decision was made to have Monty Roberts rejoin the team when they reached Europe. The higher ups at Thomas wanted Monty to drive the last leg of the race, or more specifically, they wanted the PR photos of the famous, handsome race car driver at the helm. They thought it would sell more cars than the unknown mechanic behind the wheel. On July 26th, 5.5 months after the starting pistol was fired in Times Square, the Protos, driven by the German team, crossed the finish line. However, the American team still had 41 days to get to Paris and still be considered the winner. Not only did the Americans have the 15-day bonus due to their Alaska issue, but the Germans had also snuck their car onto a train at one point and were penalized 30 days. It took only 4 more days for the Thomas to join them, with Schuster still behind the wheel. However, there was one last hurdle the American team had to face before victory. Within view of the finish line, after traveling 21,933 miles across 6 countries in 3 continents, the Thomas Flyer was pulled over because it didn't have 2 working headlights. Earlier, a pigeon had crashed into one of the lights, making it inoperable. Because of this, the French police wouldn't let it drive on the streets of Paris. A nearby cyclist overheard the issue and placed his bike with a headlight on the hood. That was good enough for the cops, and Schuster rolled into history. So, if you're wondering why the Thomas Company isn't still around, well, the Great Race was both good and bad for the Thomas Company. It was great for the automobile in general. People trusted cars now, and they specifically trusted American cars. In 1907, your top American automakers were Ford and Buick. Ford made less than 15,000 cars that year. Well, Buick made 4,600. By 1910, just 2 years after the race, both companies were producing more than 30,000 cars each. A company like Thomas couldn't compete. They didn't have the infrastructure to produce the volume required to meet the demand or the technology to compete financially. New models like Ford's Model T made cars for the everyman. It was no longer just a luxury item. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this story. Until next time, I'm Christopher Damian. This is History, Mystery, and The Unexplained. And thank you for listening.